Good evening, everybody. My name's Sarah Pearce, and I'm the chair of the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society. And it's my great honour to welcome Dr. Meron Piotrkowski for this evening's lecture on the Jews of Oxyrhynchus and indeed of the Jews of ancient Egypt in general. And I will say a little bit more about Meron in a moment, but I just want to say a few words about the society in case you're new to us. We have a monthly lecture hosted by the Society, and that's been the case more or less continuously since 1961, the year we were founded, in the heyday of the beginning of really exciting archaeological discoveries in Israel, when it became really evident to our founders that it was important to bring knowledge of the new research, the new excavations, the new finds to a wider public in Britain. And now, thanks to Zoom, we're able to do this on an international basis. So our focus is on sharing the archaeological world of Israel and the Near East from prehistoric times to the Ottoman era. And in addition to our regular series of lectures, mostly on Zoom, but some of them in person, we also have a program of travel grants for students to assist them in taking part in archaeological excavations in Israel when the security situation permits, and we very much hope that that will be the case soon. And our work also funds and distributes our international academic journal, Strata, which publishes original archaeological studies together with some of the latest news and book reviews connected to the archaeology of Israel and the Near East. So if you're not already a member of our society, please do consider joining us. You'll find our rates are very reasonable. You'll get a very warm welcome and also many opportunities for engaging with the diverse world of the archaeology of Israel and the Near East. And to find out more about us, please visit our website or contact our wonderful administrator, Claire Wilkins. And so to introduce Dr. Piotrkowski, Meron, really honoured to have you with us, Meron. Meron has a PhD from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and he is now Associate Professor of Ancient Jewish History at the University of Oxford. Meron is a historian of antiquity who specializes in many things within the broad range of the Second Temple period and indeed beyond, thanks to his work on the Oxyrhynchus papyri. And he has a particular focus on the Jewish diaspora in Egypt. And among his many really important publications, I don't know if people can see this. I can't see myself in the... Can you see it, Meron?
Yes, it's wonderful. Yes.
Yes. So this is Meron's
Thanks.
wonderful monograph, Priests in Exile, the history of the Temple of Onias and its community in the Hellenistic period, in which he works with literary texts, with inscriptions, papyri, material evidence to put together a really unique and exciting reconstruction of the world of this particular community, which had such important relations with Jerusalem as well, connections to Jerusalem. And Meron is also a major contributor, I hope you can see this too, to the new Corpus Papyrorum Judaicarum, which continues and supplements the great work of Victor Chirikova and his colleagues, which began in the 1950s, are collecting the papyri of the Jewish papyri of Egypt, papyri that can be identified as either written by Jews or concerning Jews, whether positively or occasionally negatively. And it's a wonderful collection. At least 2 volumes are already out. And others due. I think 2 more volumes are due. Is that correct, Meron? I think, yes. And what's particularly exciting about them is that unlike the original, which dealt with Greek papyri, this now includes material in other languages and other scripts. So it includes Aramaic, Hebrew, Demotic, and even hieroglyphs. Meron's current book project focuses on the history of the Jewish community of Oxyrhynchus in Egypt during the Hellenistic, the Roman, and the Byzantine periods. An incredibly ambitious and exciting project looking at the continuity of Jews in Egypt in a period when often historians in the past have argued that Jews disappear from the record for a substantial time after the revolts under Trajan. And so, enough of me. I want to hand over now to Meron and to thank you very much for being willing to give your lecture, which I'm looking forward to very much, on mapping the Jews of ancient Egypt from the Hellenistic period to the Arab conquest. Thank you, Meron.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for your kind and generous introduction, Sarah, and for inviting me to speak here at this distinguished Anglo-Israeli Archaeological Society. It's really a great honor to be here. And in fact, I was thinking a lot, what can you talk at a archaeological society when you're an ancient historian, not dealing with any archaeology? But I do, as you said, however, work with papyri, and these are, we should not forget, archaeological artifacts. And they do, in fact, form the base of what I am going to speak about today, which is namely mapping the Jews of Egypt and especially what we can learn from it about their history and communal development through an interactive map. The interactive map of, hold on, yeah, this is how it looks like. The interactive map of the Jews of Egypt based on documents and inscriptions, which I coined I Am Jedi, no pun intended. So this project was created together with my partner in crime, Mr. Shaked Kedar, who is something of a computer wizard, unlike me being a low-tech ancient historian. But before we start exploring the map, let me outline what I will be talking about today. I will begin by introducing I Am Jedi, as I mentioned, an interactive map of the Jews of Egypt based on documents and inscriptions. I will then move on to some methodological remarks, since creating a map from documentary evidence requires careful consideration. I will pay particular attention to the period of the Diaspora Revolt, focusing on the changes that occurred during this time and showing how the map can help us draw additional insights from the evidence. After that, I will turn to an analysis of the data and present several test cases, including the Fayum, Antinopolis, Oxyrhynchus, and Upper Egypt, to explore what they can tell us about the development of Jewish communities in Egypt over time. And this will be followed by some concluding remarks. So let us turn to methodology. There is both a high-tech and a low-tech component to the map, and I will briefly address each. Let me begin with the low-tech side, the actual data underlying this map. At its foundation lies an old-fashioned list I compiled of all the Jewish papyri known to me, together with the Jewish inscriptions from Egypt. The time frame I set runs from the Hellenistic period to the Muslim conquest, so roughly a millennium from the 3rd century BCE to the 7th century CE. For the papyri, I have used both the old Corpus Papyrorum Judaicarum, or old CPJ, edited by Viktor Cherikova, Alexander Fuchs, and Menachem Stern, as well as the new CPJ, edited by Tal Ilan, Noah Chacham, in collaboration with our colleague Jujana Santo and myself. This is why I have access to all the material, including papyri not yet published, but forthcoming in volumes 6.1 and 6.2. For the Hebrew and Aramaic papyri, I have relied on Colette Sirah's Les papyrus en caractère hébraïque trouvés en Égypte, pardon my French, and for the inscriptions, I have relied on her variant noise Jewish inscriptions from the Greco-Roman Egypt, known as Jigger, along with a number of inscriptions we have already published in the new CPJ and others that will appear there soon in volume 6. As it happens, some of the papyri and epigraphic material are of uncertain provenance, so in all 23, which is crucial information if you're producing a map. Some are of uncertain date, likewise crucial if one wants to show developments over time. And naturally, I have excluded these documents from the list. Remaining the realm of chronology, what should be done with papyri whose dates cannot be pinned down to a single century, but are instead given as a range. So for example, a papyrus that is dated tentatively to the 3rd to the 5th century CE, or the 5th, or until the 7th century CE, what do we do with these? I have chosen to allow for a calculated degree of statistical inaccuracy. So documents with a span are counted in each century of that range. Thus, a text dated to the third to the fifth century will appear in the third, the fourth, and the fifth centuries, ensuring its general presence across the period. This approach does affect the statistics, but since only a rather small number of texts fall into this category, the margin of error remains minor. Um, Within the framework of our revision and continuation of the old CPJ, the question arose, how Jewish is the old CPJ? So at times, Cherikova and his editors appear to have been rather generous in including certain papyri that for various reasons do not seem to be Jewish. Accordingly, I have excluded such cases here, particularly from late antiquity, where the evidence sometimes points to a Christian rather than to a Jewish origin of a papyrus. For example, CPJ 3476, which is dated to the late 3rd or 4th century CE, mentions an Isaac, son of Meses, who in my view was more likely Christian than Jewish. Similarly, CPJ 3465, labeled a list of Roman soldiers and dated to 205 CE, is written partly in Greek and partly in Latin. It records three individuals with Semitic names, Gadius, Malochus, and Malichus, whom Chirikova identified as Jews on the basis of their Semitic names. Yet, since Semitic names alone do not necessarily indicate Jewishness, I have chosen to exclude these two papyri from the present survey. Other CPJ texts not included come from the archive of the Roman official Apollonius, who served as a strategos or general of the Heptacomias, an administrative district in the Fayum, so in the Arsinoid nome. Apollonius maintained regular correspondence with his hometown of Hermopolis, where his wife Aline, his daughter Heraidus, and his mother Eudaimonis lived. He was active during the reign of Hadrian, following the succession of Trajan, and at the time of the Jewish diaspora revolt in Egypt. About 200 documents from his archive survive, mostly consisting of letters exchanged between Apollonius, his family, and his staff, although only a few dozen are of marginal relevance to the revolt. Since correspondence is largely personal in nature, I have included here only one papyrus that refers to fighting in the Hermopolis area and thus provides evidence of Jews there. The rest of the archive has not been counted among the documents forming the basis of this map. Another issue concerns literary papyri. While the inclusion of literary papyri alongside documentary material in any historical survey of the Jews in Egypt is both important and necessary, it presents certain difficulties here. Most of the literary papyri, especially those in Greek, preserve fragments of Jewish Hellenistic literature, later Septuagint papyri, or magical papyri, whose origins are uncertain, that is, whether they are Jewish manuscripts at all. Where the provenance is clear, I have included literary papyri such as religious fragments, so piyutim, and biblical texts in Hebrew and Aramaic. CPJ 2 and 5 also contain several papyri belonging to the anti-Jewish Alexandrian literary genre known as the Acts of the Alexandrian Martyrs, fictitious texts narrating the trials, speeches, and often violent deaths of Alexandrian notables in their confrontations with Roman authorities. These works were composed by non-Jews for non-Jewish audiences. They mention Jews only incidentally and contribute little to our knowledge of Jewish settlement beyond the mere fact of their presence in Alexandria. For this reason, I have also included these papyri from the present survey. So in all, the map includes a total of 642 papyri and inscriptions. I now turn to the more technical side of the project. How did we determine where to place the dots and how to apply them to the digital map? In other words, how did we identify the location of, say, Antinopolis and then locate it on the map? For this, we relied on the database Trismegistos, an expansive interdisciplinary digital portal for papyrological and epigraphical resources from Egypt, covering something like this 800 BCE to 800 CE, that now extends to the wider ancient world. The platform aggregates metadata on texts, collections, archives, individuals, places, and more, drawing on a vast range of published sources. For the identification of locations, the database relies on archaeological data and the established identification of ancient Egyptian sites. Our map is based on Tableau, and I hope this works, but it looks like this. And the fun thing is that you can play around with it. And if you, I don't know if you see this, but it will change over time. So we're gonna look at this more closely, but if I want to know how many Jews lived from the 1st century BCE until the 4th century CE, it will give me this. And if I look a little bit early in the 3rd century, it changes. So we can play around with it, which makes it really interesting. Okay. So Tableau, which is a data visualization software that allows researchers to transform complex data sets into clear interactive graphics. Unlike static charts or printed maps, Tableau makes it possible to explore information dynamically. Viewers can zoom in, filter, or highlight different aspects of the data according to their interests. At its core, Tableau works by connecting to a structured data set, such as our list of papyri. Each column of the data set represents a type of information. So, for example, the name of a site, its latitude and longitude, the period to which it belongs, or the kind of evidence that attests to it, while each row records a single observation. Tableau then translates these data points into visual form, arranging them on maps, charts, or dashboards with only minimal setup. For mapping, Tableau relies on its own mapping service, which is powered by a Mapbox and OpenStreetMap rather than on Google Maps, which we probably all use. This means that the background images one sees in a Tableau map are not navigational tools, but visual layers designed to provide geographic context. The actual placement of sites depends on latitude and longitude provided by us, that is, in this case, as noted, the information provided by Trismegistos Places, making it possible to plot ancient towns and villages that do not appear in modern geocoding databases. Once mapped, the data can be linked to filters that allow a user to move between time periods, as we just saw, types of evidence, or different categories of settlement, all within the same interface. So how can we use the map, and what is it good for? So it can show us where Jewish communities were located in ancient Egypt and help elucidate whether settlement patterns changed across historical periods, for example, between the Ptolemaic and Roman/Byzantine periods. Do we see continuity or the disappearance of certain communities? Did Jews primarily reside in major urban centers such as Alexandria or Oxyrhynchus, or also in smaller villages? Can we trace mobility or interactions between communities across different nomes? Can we learn something about Jewish economic behavior, networks, and related dynamics? And last but not least, arguably the most interesting and insightful question, what impact the diaspora revolt had on the presence of Jews in Egypt? There are, of course, many more questions that could be asked, but if we focus on these, here are some insights. So when we look at the overall spread of Jews in Egypt from the Hellenistic period until the Arab conquest, we can see that Jews were living all over Egypt, but not everywhere in Egypt. For example, it seems that Jews did not settle south of Hermopolis and north of the Thebaid, so in the region of Aphrodite, Panopolis, etc. Why? I have no idea. Maybe it's too hot, but perhaps further evidence will emerge as more papyri are published that will change that picture. What changes can be observed from the Ptolemaic to the Roman period and from the Roman to the Byzantine period? We see a process of urbanization. The main centers of Jewish settlements are Oxyrhynchus, Alexandria, Antinopolis, and Hermopolis Magna, while Upper Egypt is scarcely represented, and I will come back to this later. In fact, the majority of Jews in Egypt appear to have been concentrated in Middle Egypt and to a lesser extent in Lower Egypt. We can also see that Jews like the rest of the population of Egypt, much as is still the case today, tended to settle along the waterways of the Nile and in larger urban centers such as Alexandria.
Like everybody
Um,
else.
but um, there are also a few oddballs. So, for example, we find Jews in the eastern desert at the quarries of Mons Claudianus and in the Red Sea port of Berenike. Their presence in these remote locations can be explained by economic reasons. Joseph, son of Abietis, a water supplier, delivered provisions to a police garrison that guarded the camel trade routes through the desert. He moved between the outpost and Oxyrhynchus and seems to have resided in both places. Mons Claudianus, located in Egypt's eastern desert, was a major Roman quarry site where marble was extracted for prestigious imperial projects. Huge columns, obelisks, and architectural blocks were cut from the mountainside and transported by camel to the Nile, then shipped to Rome and other cities of the empire. So numerous inscriptions in ostraka have been discovered at the site. Among them, 3 Jews are attested as part of the local workforce. Berenike, a port on Egypt's Red Sea coast, founded in the Ptolemaic period, became a vital hub of trade in the Roman era. Spices, textiles, and precious stones arrived from India and Arabia, while Egyptian grain, glass, and other goods were exported. Archaeological finds, including temples, warehouses, and multilingual inscriptions, highlight its role as a cosmopolitan center linking the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean. Among these discoveries were several ostraka in Hebrew or Aramaic, attesting to the presence of Jewish customs officials. These 3 examples not only demonstrate the diversity of professions among Jews, but also show that, as one might expect, Jews settled even in remote parts of Egypt for economic reasons. So, with these brief insights in mind, I'd like to now turn perhaps to the most vexing issue, namely the Jewish diaspora revolt and the question of the level of destruction. But perhaps first, a few words about that revolt. Um, it has no Josephus to tell us its reasons, dimensions, and outcome. Uh, its geographical spread is somewhat disputed, so we know that fighting was in Cyrene and Egypt and Cyprus, perhaps Judea and Mesopotamia. The reasons for the revolt similarly remain unclear, but we think that Messianism, the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, the Fiscus Judaicus, as well as social, economic, political, and ideological competition and rivalry between Jews and Greeks in Egypt certainly played a role. It was an extremely violent and bloody conflict that resulted in the near destruction of Egyptian Jewry, which was one of the largest diasporas in the ancient world. It brought about the formation of a new, predominantly Hebrew and Aramaic speaking community. As part of another project, which is my work on Oxyrhynchus, I was kind of curious to see uh, where fighting was going on in Egypt, and this is what I managed to track down based on literary and documentary sources, and it largely covers the same areas in which Jews resided, as we saw. So the Kabuni's opinion is that Egyptian Jewry was extinguished in its entirety in the wake of the revolt. Here's what Cherikova says um, in the CPJ. The general impression is that of a complete breakdown of Jewish life in Egypt, at any rate at the beginning of this period. A few pages later, however, he nuances his earlier remarks, though he does not retract his opinion. So he says, blah, 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 and the results could easily be foreseen. They amounted to the total extermination of the Egyptian Jews, which is kind of what we heard before. But then he says, a little bit later, further down, we are fairly safe in assuming that in many places, the Jewish population was totally annihilated, which is, of course, not the same thing. So, were all the Jews killed in the diaspora revolt, or are there any traces of survival? A closer look reveals 14 Jewish documents in Greek from post-117 Egypt, and while that may not seem like much, it is certainly not negligible. In relative terms, we have 20 documents attesting Jews in the 4th century and only 12 in the 6th century, yet no scholar would argue that Jews had disappeared from Egypt in those periods or that this decline reflects the devastating effects of a revolt. We should also keep in mind that A, not all papyri have yet been edited, meaning the evidence will continue to change over time, and B, in the later Roman and Byzantine periods, it becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish Jews from Christians in Greek documents, since by the mid-4th century CE, Christians had begun adopting Jewish names, helping to explain in part the smaller number of attestations in, for example, the 6th century. In conclusion, there is evidence of Jewish life after the diaspora revolt, though it clearly had an impact on the size of the Jewish population in Egypt. And we find that in the 3rd century, Jewish life concentrated mainly in Middle Egypt. For drawing such conclusions, microhistories are of particularly importance. I am, in fact, as Sarah mentioned, currently working on one myself, namely on the Jews of Oxyrhynchus, about whom I will speak in a moment. Before doing so, however, I'd like to emphasize that I Am Jedi can help us trace migrations and changes in specific places and communities. So to illustrate this, I will present 4 cases: the Fayum region, the polis of Antinopolis, the metropolis of Oxyrhynchus, and Upper Egypt, specifically Edfu or Apollonopolis Magna. What changes can we observe in these areas over time, and what do they reveal about the history of the settlement in Egypt? I'll begin with the Fayum. The Fayum is a fertile oasis region in Middle Egypt, west of the Nile, that played a significant role in antiquity as a center of agricultural settlement and cultural exchange. Under the Ptolemies, especially from the 3rd century BCE, the area was developed extensively through irrigation projects and the foundation of new villages and towns, many populated with Greek and other settlers alongside native Egyptians. The Fayum became a crossroads of languages and traditions, reflected in the extraordinary papyrological finds that document contracts, letters, petitions, tax registers, and literary works. Among its diverse population were substantial Jewish communities, attested from the Hellenistic through the Roman periods. Jews are recorded in the papyri as landowners, soldiers, and administrators, and some villages even bore names linked with Jewish presence. Because of the Ptolemies' aggressive settlement policy, we see a large concentration of Jews in the Fayum from the 3rd century BCE onward. But there is a visible decline by the 1st century BCE. For the moment, I cannot fully explain this shift, but one possible factor may be the dismantling of the Ptolemaic army by the Romans. During the Ptolemaic period, large numbers of Jewish military clerus, that is, military settlers, were established in the Fayum. When the Romans disbanded the Ptolemaic army after their takeover around 30 BCE, these settlers may have lost both their military affiliation and possibly also their land holdings. This could account for the decline in Jewish presence during that time. Be that as it may, around the 2nd century CE, Jewish settlement picked up again, and despite some fluctuations, Jews remained continuously present in the area. We may therefore regard the Fayum as a stronghold of Jewish life in Egypt from Ptolemaic times onward. My next example is Antinopolis. Antinopolis was a city in Middle Egypt, founded by the Roman Emperor Hadrian in 130 CE on the east bank of the Nile, right opposite of Hermopolis. It was named after Hadrian's companion Antinos, who had drowned in the Nile nearby, and the city became both a memorial to him and a flourishing provincial capital. Built on a grand Roman plan with colonnaded streets, temples, a theater, a hippodrome, Antinopolis stood out as a model of Greco-Roman urbanism in Egypt. Over time, it also became an important Christian center with numerous churches and a bishopric in late antiquity. Jews are attested in the region since the Ptolemaic period, but we see a steady growth of the population and an eventual shift towards the city um, in that time. This is supported by several papyrus finds that attest to a vivid Jewish life there, including fragments of the one, it is, of the biblical books of Job and Kings in Hebrew, as well as perhaps the best known document from that city, the so-called Ktubah from Antinopolis, which is now housed in Cologne and dated to 417 CE. This text is particularly significant as it is the only dated document in Jewish script from the period between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Cairo Geniza. Since Antinopolis was founded in the Roman period and maintained a steady Jewish presence through that and later times, with Jews arriving from elsewhere, it reflects the broader trend of urbanization in the period in which Jews actively participated. And with that, I move on to my next example, which is Oxyrhynchus, which was an important city in Middle Egypt, about 160 kilometers south of Cairo, best known today for the vast collection of papyri discovered there in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Refounded in the Hellenistic period and flourishing under Roman and Byzantine rule, Oxyrhynchus was a vibrant provincial center with temples, churches, and monasteries. Its ancient rubbish heaps preserved an unparalleled archive of everyday documents, letters, contracts, receipts, and official records, as well as literary and religious texts in Greek, Latin, Coptic, Syriac, Aramaic, and Hebrew. The Oxyrhynchus Papyri series, still being published, include works by classical authors otherwise lost, early Christian writings, and evidence for the social, economic, and religious life of the city over many centuries, making Oxyrhynchus one of the richest archaeological sources for understanding life in Greco-Roman Egypt. In Oxyrhynchus, Jews are already attested in the Ptolemaic period, yet their numbers seem to grow steadily from the Roman period onwards. Now, one particular telling piece of onomastic evidence helps us trace how some of these communities may have reached Oxyrhynchus from further south. The name Abieti is a fascinating example. It is unique to Upper Egypt. It is found nowhere else in the ancient Near East. We first encounter it at Edfu, or Apollonopolis Magna, where it appears in Aramaic form Abieti on ostraca from the Persian period. Roughly a century later, we find it again, further north in Thebes and later still in Oxyrhynchus, this time Hellenized as Abietos or Abietes. And this shift from Aramaic to Greek and from the deep south to Middle Egypt beautifully illustrates both cultural adaptation and physical movement. And it mirrors the broader demographic trend that our map reveals, a gradual northward migration of Jewish communities over time from Upper Egypt toward the major urban centers in Middle Egypt. The apparent and visible increase in population, however, may be linked not only to the actual demographic change, but also to the discovery of the papyri, since such a large proportion of surviving documents come from there. A similar phenomenon can be observed at Antinopolis, though here the statistical weight is different, again reflecting the unequal volume of papyri preserved and recovered from the two sites, which themselves differed in size. But overall, this development is also linked to the overall tangible urbanization that occurred in late antiquity, roughly from the 3rd, 4th century onwards, and the documents attest a thriving community there, which was active until the Muslim conquest in the 7th century. Let's have a look at my last example, Edfu in Upper Egypt. Known in the Hellenistic period by its Greek name Apollonopolis Magna, Edfu was a key urban center situated in the west bank of the Nile, south of Thebes, and served as the capital of its nome in Upper Egypt. The city's name reflects the Hellenistic Interpretatio Graeca, identifying the Egyptian falcon god Horus with the Greek god Apollo. During the Ptolemaic era, Edfu became renowned primarily for its grand temple of Horus, one of the best preserved examples of temple architecture from this era. Since the Persian period, Upper Egypt was a major Jewish stronghold. In particular, in Edfu and Thebes, Diospolis Magna, Jews are attested in comparatively large numbers. Whilst the heyday of Jewish settlement there seems to be in the 3rd to the 2nd century BCE, by the 1st century BCE, these numbers are declining, only to go up again in the 1st century CE and still visible in the 2nd century CE. But by the 3rd century, there are no longer any Jews attested in Edfu until the Muslim conquest. It might be likely that this development is linked to the demographic changes in the wake of the diaspora revolt. In Thebes, so Diospolis Magna, which is right nearby, by the 1st century CE, only a few Jews are attested, and by the 2nd century, none at all. By contrast, in nearby Kokodopolis, some Jews are still attested in the 2nd century CE. From the 4th century onwards, there are again small signs of Jewish life in Thebes. But overall, however, from the 3rd century onwards, as I said, southern Egypt appears to be largely devoid of Jews, who seem instead to have concentrated in the north, especially in Alexandria, and in Middle Egypt, primarily in the metropoles such as Alcinoe, Oxyrhynchus, Antinopolis, Hermopolis Magna, and other urban centers. And with this, I'd like to offer some concluding remarks. What can we learn from the map? Mapping of Jewish communities in Egypt from the Hellenistic to the Byzantine periods reveals both continuity and striking regional shifts. While Jews were once present throughout the country, including in Upper Egypt, the numbers there steadily diminished from the 1st to the 3rd century CE, leaving the south virtually devoid of Jewish life until sporadic signs reappear in late antiquity. By contrast, Middle Egypt emerged as the primary center of Jewish settlement, with flourishing communities and major metropoles such as Oxyrhynchus, Antinopolis, Hermopolis Magna, and Arsinoe, complemented by the enduring prominence of Alexandria in the north. This development reflects broader patterns of urbanization, economic opportunity, and integration into provincial life, as well as the demographic consequences of events such as the diaspora revolt. While the revolt undoubtedly had a profound impact on the Jewish population of Egypt, it did not result in a total destruction. There are signs of survival. I hope to have shown that mapping is an important tool for analyzing the history of the Jews of Egypt in antiquity, turning scattered fragments of evidence into a coherent picture of Jewish life across the centuries, and visualizing not only where Jews lived, but also how they adapted to Egypt's changing social and political landscapes. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Meron, for an absolutely wonderful lecture. Really, really exciting. And we've got some great questions already in the chat. May I
Thank you.
start by taking chair's privilege by asking the first question? Which is really about the distribution of papyri. It's an old question, but how one
Yes.
relates the distribution of papyri to ideas about settlements coming and going and disappearing. Because you mentioned particularly the 1st century BCE and also in terms of location, the Thebaid, and both that period and that place are well, we have far less papyri from those that period and that place than for some of the other places like the Fayum, and Oxyrhynchus, of course. So it's a classic question, I know, to be asked about, particularly for the Ptolemaic period. But how would
Yeah.
you address that? You know, does the fact we don't have many papyri from the Thebaid mean we don't have many Jews?
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes. I mentioned this throughout my paper, but these things will change over time. In fact, I call this the problem of relativity because I can only look at my state of knowledge at the moment. So obviously this will change. We Statistic-wise, yes, we have less papyri from the Ptolemaic period, which is linked to their state of preservation. That being, when you look at excavation levels, they're logically closer to the water, and hence we don't have too many of them. When it comes to the south, however, this is interesting because the climate is different, and and it's also a question of material used, meaning that mainly in the south, they like to use ostraca, which are more durable. And
Yes.
I mean, they break easily, but they're more durable in that climate than a papyrus, probably. Um, I think it's significant what we have, and we likely find. I'm quite convinced that we likely find more material. I think that the German Archaeological Institute is digging quite successfully for examples in places still like Elephantine, and they keep on finding things,
Yeah.
and they're currently new. I recall having been at the just recent conference, the International Conference of Papyrology, and flicking through another new volume of papyri and ostraca from Elephantine. So these things still are being dug out, and statistic, I believe, will improve with time. Um, Again, I'm very much aware that whatever I present here and can say, and that pertains also to my study of Oxyrhynchus, is temporarily. And I presume that in 20 years, someone will come up and give a lecture at the Archaeological Society and say this
Yes,
Piotrkowski
please.
had no idea what he talked about.
Oh, no, no, that won't be true. But no, absolutely. Thank you.
If that
Um,
if that helps, yes.
yeah, absolutely. We've got lots more questions. Very different one next. How do the writings of Philo affect your studies?
Um, Not really. Philo is a great case of someone whom we know was active in Alexandria, and I can confidently say that Jews were still around in that time, based on literary evidence. When it comes to incorporating a literary papyrus, that contains texts from Philo, which we indeed have. We have actually two codices. One that is here in Oxford from Oxford, because the other is in Paris, I think. So we kind of I would hesitate to incorporate this here in my study, because we cannot really establish if this codex belonged to Jews, uh, was created by Jews, and it's actually more likely that they're being Christian. So I would shy away on using this here in the statistics, as again this is tricky, incorporating the literary papyri, and I approached a kind of minimalistic approach to be careful with these things. Um, yes, I hope that helps to answer the
That's great.
question.
Thank you. So from Hugh Williamson, I believe there was also a large Samaritan community in Egypt. Can their
Yes.
remains be easily distinguished from Jewish material? Does this affect your conclusions in any way?
Thank you. Great question. I Well, there are sections. We can distinguish between them mainly in late antiquity. And once you notice, we will have a section also in the new CPJ, and there's also a section in the old CPJ talking about Samaritans. Then they're not easily distinguishable, really. We know that they are located presumably in the Fayoum a lot, in places such as the village of Samaria. Um,
Yes,
I have been mindful of them. I set them aside for the moment, um, just to be precautious. And this, we can easily expand this later, but it's definitely something that should be considered here. I may not have
great.
mentioned them yeah, I only have 35 minutes.
Well, it's
But thank you for
amazing
that
what you've
question. It's
managed to
really
come.
important. Yes.
So Anthony Raven, if I understand the stats correctly, you're assuming a close correlation between the volume of findings of documents for a given place and date with the size of the Jewish community there at a given date. What are the risks that the samples are biased? In other words, for example, that external events led to destruction of documents relating to places that actually had sizable Jewish communities.
Yes, thank you. That's a wonderful observation. Again, I am mainly working with a limited data set. So I'm more interested in seeing a ping on a map, and one is really enough. I'm not going to fight you on the question of population sizes in various places because I don't know. I can only attest a number that I have, based on the number of documents that are discovered at the place. But I won't dare to say that this was a huge community. We may think that it was a huge community at some stage in time. And this is where outside information or supplementary information can come in when we have literary text talking, for example, about the community in Alexandria, which we think is quite substantial, just to give an example. Um, but yes, and there's always a debate on, me working on Oxyrhynchus, there's a huge debate about the population size in general, not only Jews, through time. And again, I'd like not to get into that debate.
Okay.
That
Very
makes
big
sense. Yeah.
debate question.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, yeah, lots more questions. I think you did mention it, but there's a question about how many Jewish documents have been found in total in Egypt. I
Oh, yeah.
think you
Wonderful.
said 642 papyri and inscriptions.
Yes, these are text. Hold on. I have to qualify this. These are the
Hmm.
texts that I included in my survey. Um, there are substantially more, and you have to look very closely what you're dealing with and what you want to include. So for example, this is the question of something that we addressed in the project on the new collection, because Cherikova and his colleagues were quite large in including documents. So if we work with these numbers, there would be substantially more um, um, than perhaps what we think. But in all, I would roughly say about 1,000 papyri that we know of, um, and inscriptions. I don't know, a few hundred. I'm sorry, I have to go and recheck. But it's roughly around 1,000 papyri that we know of that we may consider Jewish, and about, I'd say. Um, Perhaps 20% of that may be literal.
Thank you. It's described as a tangential matter. Can you explain why the Romans were quarrying marble in the Egyptian Eastern Desert when Italy is most famous for its marble?
Um, well, that's a nice question. Probably for its beauty, because of its beauty, some of the Rosetta marble, it's called, can only be sourced from there. So obviously they have different colors involved, and the more you have of a colorful spectrum in a palace or public building is obviously more astonishing. So we know that, for example, there's Turkey is famous for its green marble. And so I do think that part of the aesthetic really is a big aspect of it, as maybe economic reasons. It may have been cheaper. Mind you also that a good chunk of this, I mean, I mentioned three documents involving Jews. There were camel drivers and donkey drivers, so in transport, but there were also slaves working there. So, and you can consider this cheap labor. Um, so I'd say there's an economic and an aesthetic aspect to it, and yeah, it's part of its beauty. I guess. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. And then taking us away from the world in which papyri were found, but very important, has there been found any trace of the Great Synagogue in Alexandria?
Oh yeah, we wish we would find it. No.
Yes, with a flag.
No, unfortunately not. And so we did not find also the grave of or the tomb of Alexander. But things are still being excavated, and we kind of also tried to figure out where the Jewish quarter was in Alexandria, if it was more to the west or more towards the sea. Um,
Mm.
the famous Delta Quarter. Mind you, it may have moved over time. But unfortunately, no. But we have a wonderful text about this in rabbinic literature, and we may suffice by enjoying that.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Um, so, does your data yield any evidence for Jewish immigration to Egypt from Palestine?
Yeah, wonderful question. Yes and no, and that's a question that I'm actually quite preoccupied with. So the main indicator and the reason why we think there was a huge influx from the region of Palestine is mainly in the Aramaic and the usage of the Galilean or Palestinian dialect of Aramaic that we find in the Aramaic papyri, and hence we think with Aramaic and Hebrew picking up in late antiquity that these are newcomers coming in from the north. Um, we know also there are several papyri that talk about um, yeah, traveling slash networking with communities in Eretz Israel. So we know that there is traffic going on, basically. How many? It's difficult to say, but we think it's substantial. But I want to add that this is something that has been going on for centuries. This is not new, and we are, in fact, we already have it in the Bible, and of course the rabbis are not particularly happy when you go down to Egypt. But this also shows that there was eager traffic and travel between both areas.
Thank you. We're really putting a lot of questions to you. I hope that's all right, Meron.
That's all right. As long as I can
Um,
answer them, that's fine.
wow. It's wonderful that you can. Um, is there evidence in the archaeological or historical records of Jewish communities in southern Egypt, in Upper Egypt, around the time of the Islamic conquests?
Um, I have to recheck that actually. This is sort of I'm sorry, but this is sort of the cutoff period where I stop. What I can say is just from my experience from Oxyrhynchus, that Oxyrhynchus, for example, seems to have been destroyed. There's a hiatus in general in papyri discoveries in that time, and it will pick up a little bit later, a few decades later, 20 years after 10, 15, 20 years after the Muslim conquest. So a little bit similar to what I think about the diaspora revolt. Places were destroyed along, perhaps not every place. So we kind of have to look regionally and see, what happened where and when. But I have to go back to that and see. My assumption is that, people will come back at some stage.
And then, how much of the time variation in Jewish documents reflects the wider time variation in the survival of all documents? Oh, that's quite difficult. That is, are time periods with fewer Jewish documents also
Yeah.
periods with few documents of any kind?
Yes, that's a great question. It's also there you kind of have to look where you got the evidence from. As I noted, there's a substantial difference between papyrus discoveries in, say, Antinopolis and Oxyrhynchus. Um, so this data indeed varies. Um, it helps, and that's a bit what I was trying to do. It helps to look more at a general picture and see, what happens in other centuries. Do we have lots of documents there? Where do we have lots of documents? Where do we not have a lot of documents? And kind of compare it. Um, it's also tricky to sometimes it happened to me for a couple of documents where you kind of look more generally on where they have been discovered. And it would say, for example, I have a papyrus that was discovered in the Fayoum, which is fine, but it talks a lot about Jews that come from elsewhere. So what do you do with that text? So I split them up. So I say if these Jews came from the south, I tested them in that period in the south as well as in the Fayum because they probably wrote to someone who was there. Um, so we also should think that documents do travel. Yeah.
And probably the final question, I think, if that's all right. Were there periods of greater or lesser hostility to Jews or
Yeah.
anti-Jewishness, says in the chat? Can you tell that from your data?
Um, Another great question. No, not from the data that I have. Um, we see though that anti-Judaism will start to pick up with the Roman conquest. And reason why I know this is these fragments of the so-called Acts of the Alexandrian Martyrs in particular. And that's a great study to do because the earliest attestation of so they all kind of start with the Alexandrian riots. That's the major historical background there that they all pertain to, at least, and that happened in the first century, very early first century CE, so in the late 30s, beginning of the 40s. Um, and the earliest fragment that we have is actually from Oxyrhynchus, but it comes from that period. So this is one. And they start to pick up. Uh, they're being copied, exponentially in the second to the third centuries. And this roughly coincides also with the rise of Christianity. And so we kind of have to think of an anti-Judaism that kind of comes up in the first century CE based on basically a political matter, um, meaning this all revolves or seems to revolve around Jewish rights and Jewish citizenship uh, and recognition within the overall Roman Empire, and the Greeks and Egyptians being upset about this, which over time, with the rise of Christianity, um, will transform to an anti-Judaism based on religion, because we see that if you have a lot of copies of a text, there seems to be some sort of appeal to it, and you should ask yourself why do people start to copy these texts, in the third century? And there's your answer. So um, the interesting thing when you find such a document already in the first century, see in Oxyrhynchus, is obviously that someone there did not really like Jews. Um, and we can witness this, of course, in other documents, mainly from late antiquity, where we find copies of anti-Jewish dialogues and yeah, literature that with similar contents. Um, Interestingly, we hardly find things like this from the Ptolemaic period, but we know of it. It's not that it wasn't existing. So we have, of course, the writings of Manetho, for example, who was a Egyptian priest writing in the third century BCE, very nastily about Jews, and he had colleagues, and Josephus tells us all about them. So we have literary evidence rather than physical evidence. But so anti-Judaism, unfortunately, was kind of always around. We have a sense that Jews were treated nicer in the Ptolemaic period, because we see that they simply got along. They served together in military units with non-Jews. They were buried alongside non-Jews. So there's no distinction of being Jewish and non-Jewish at a burial site. There is no such thing as a particularly clean Jewish cemetery as we know of probably today. So these people got along. Um, yes, I hope that answers the question.
That's great. Thank you so much for these really generous answers that show off your exceptional knowledge across a huge range of centuries and materials, and for an absolutely brilliant lecture that stimulated so many wonderful questions. So thanks very much to the audience as well, but very much to you, Meron, for a really, really wonderful lecture. I know there'd be many other questions that we would want to uh, put to you as well, because the material is so rich, raises questions like, how did Jews survive the diaspora revolt? Can your material help us to see that? What does it tell us about Jewish families, for example, and mapping generations of Jewish families? It's just wonderful, wonderful material. And you will have to come back to the society much sooner than 20 years' time, because as you say, it's such a changing scene thanks to the discoveries, the ongoing discoveries, but also the ongoing publication of there's still thousands and thousands of papyri, even from Oxyrhynchus, I believe, to be published. So we really look forward to that. But we also thank you very, very much indeed, Meron. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all those of you who joined online. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having
Take
me.
care.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.